Finish off Kennedy and Cuba. All right. On the left, remember we were talking about the pink wave, etc. Now, as I said, Eisenhower had a plan on how to invade Cuba. Now, the big deal is we can't make it look like the Americans were involved. So in Miami, it's called Little Havana for, you know, reasons. All these Cuban defectors are there. The CIA will pick up these Cuban defectors, take them to Guatemala, and train them. The idea is that these Cuban defectors, with training from the CIA and possibly a little bit of backing of American helicopters, etc., are going to storm Cuba, get rid of Castro, and establish the government. Now, the problem is this plan, as you can see, blew up in Kennedy's face. That's the pun being laid here with the cigar exploding. Here's another one. And the idea is, what did hens lay? Eggs, and it's in the shape of a oval, which is a zero, and so it's basically saying Kennedy is a zero. Now, this failed invasion attempt we call Bay of Pigs. And so this is the failed attempt of CIA-backed Cuban rebels, Cuban exiles, to remove Castro. Okay? Now, the real brains behind the Foreign Department and Secretary of Department of Defense falls to this man, Robert McNamara, who I showed you Fog of War before this man passed away, and he gave a lot of really good intentions. And one of the coolest things he did is he went in and he said, he visited Cuba, he sat down with Mr. Castro, president as he calls him, and had a really in-depth conversation with him about the next event. Now, McNamara, Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, the head lawyer in the world, is Robert Kennedy. Both men come into John F. Kennedy and say, we need to build up what is called a conventional army. Okay, and that basically means we need troops, we need guns. We don't need to just worry about nuclear arsenals. They are both afraid of what is called a nuclear holocaust. Remember, Holocaust is not just the killing of the Jews, but a really bad event. So in this case, it's if a nuclear bomb goes off, it's going to kill the whole world. And so we're afraid of that. And so we start building up this conventional army. And we're going to talk about that conventional army in the 60s, where they go. Okay? As we're building them up and doing these things here, some U-2 spy plane photographs get a hold of something interesting. And that is missile sites. Specifically, Soviet missile sites being built in Cuba. Okay? Now this happens in 1962, and we call it the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay? So we have these, what is called mid-range ballistic missile, that means it could hit the United States, being put there. Now, how do we respond? Kennedy first blockades Cuba and tells Russia, to lay off. Okay? And so, now notice he said, hell, I'm going to sink any ships that won't halt. Okay? And so they said they're building missiles, and that's why we're doing this. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The big scare is we thought they had, 25 something missiles. As McNamara finds out later on, they had hundreds. And so these are some of the possible destinations that could be hit from Havana very, very easily. This is the scary thought. Okay? And so we're both sitting on edge at this point. Here we have push buttons. Now, when Kennedy begins to start negotiating with Castro starts talking like a crazy man that something else had happened on nuclear war. He accuses the United States of having missiles in Turkey, which is true. We put nuclear missiles in Turkey, which is right outside of the Soviet Union, and that's a neutral country, and it's kind of close to them, so they did it to us. And so now it's the idea of nuclear war is about to be unleashed. We're sitting on top of these atomic bombs. Lives hang in the balance. What can we do? Khrushchev and Kennedy have a sit-down. They have a meeting. And they basically talk about how do we stop this. And they come up with a resolution. And it's so that both men can look great. Now, no one really came out on top here. Kennedy says, I talked down to the Soviet Union. Soviet Union will say, I talked down Kennedy. The idea is Khrushchev, right here, will take his missiles out of Cuba if Kennedy promises to leave Cuba alone and also get their missiles out of Turkey. And so just so you know what I'm talking about here, all these little ones with the planes and everything like that are different parts of the military we had in Turkey ready to go into the Soviet Union if necessary. Okay? So that's how it ultimately resolves. I'm going to show you a video here in a little while about some interesting things. Now, what Kennedy does after this is he actually puts an embargo on Cuba. And that means you can't get Cuban cigars or anything like that. And so the last real car they have is like from the 60s. Now, modern times have happened, and our current president has currently lifted that embargo off Cuba, and so they'll be able to start trading with them once again. And we saw some interesting stuff. The Gold Cup in soccer, the United States played Cuba, but when Cubans got here, 5 of them defected within hours of being here. I mean, they left and tried to find some place to hide so they don't have to go back to Cuba. And so that's kind of weird, right? You know, you come to represent your country, but you're going to leave. And so this episode here we call Khrushchev blinked. We say Khrushchev blinked. He kind of took a minute out of the staring contest. But, you know, you could say Kennedy blinked, either one of them, because nobody came out on top. Because in the end, cooler heads prevailed and realized if they launched the missiles on us and blew up the United States, we would launch missiles on them and blow them up, and the whole world would be done. And so basically, what's the point? And so luckily, cooler heads prevailed in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that is something we were, you know, dangerously close to ending life on this planet in 1962. And so luckily that did not happen. Now in the next little section, a couple of videos we're going to look at about Vietnam. All right?